Captain Elena Carter stood in front of the review board with her hand pressed against her mouth, staring at a stack of files stamped in red ink that read failure report. Files she had never seen, never signed, and never earned. 12 years of service, reduced in an instant to a folder of lies sitting on a mahogany table. She had walked into that office expecting a routine evaluation. She left it fighting for her career. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing who's listening. Elena had always been the kind of officer who showed up early and left last. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, and she never needed to be. Her file, until 3 weeks ago, had been clean commendations, leadership evaluations that praised her composure under pressure, a record built one honest deployment at a time. She used to joke that her service jacket was the only paperwork in her life that never lied to her. She believed that, right up until the morning her commanding officer called her into his office and slid a folder across the desk without a word. She remembered the sound the folder made against the wood. A small, dry scrape that seemed too quiet for what it contained. Inside were reports she had never filed. Mission assessments claiming she'd missed critical deadlines during a deployment she remembered finishing 2 days ahead of schedule. Leadership reviews accusing her of insubordination during an exercise she had actually been commended for, in writing by the same command that now denied it. Someone had reached into her record and rewritten her history, page by page, and done it well enough that even she, staring at her own name typed above the lies, felt a flicker of doubt about what she actually remembered. That is the cruelest part of a forged record. It doesn't just threaten your future. It makes you question your own past. The room outside the commander's office had gone quiet by the time she stepped back into the hallway. Word travels fast in a unit that small, and by noon she could feel it. The sideways glances, the conversations that stopped a half-second too late when she walked past. 2 senior officers, men she had served alongside for years, sat across from her that afternoon with their arms crossed and their jaws tight, watching her the way people watch a stranger, not a colleague. Nobody accused her outright. Nobody needed to. The silence did that for them. She went home that night and didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, running her fingers along the edge of an old commendation letter she'd kept in a drawer for years, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. It was proof, she told herself. Proof that somewhere, underneath all of this, the truth still existed on paper. She just had to find enough of it before the board finished deciding her fate without her. She thought she'd never find who did this. She was wrong. It started with a name she almost missed. A logistics clerk 2 ranks below her, someone she'd barely spoken to in passing, whose access credentials appeared on the digital trail of one altered report at 2:47 in the morning, months earlier. Elena stared at the timestamp for a long time. She hadn't asked for an investigation. She hadn't accused anyone. She had simply asked, quietly and formally, for an audit of her own file, a request most people in her position were too exhausted or too afraid to make, because an audit could just as easily confirm the lies as expose them. The days that followed moved slower than any deployment she'd ever been on. She sat through meetings where officers spoke about her in careful, clinical language, as though her career were a case file rather than a life. She caught herself, more than once, wondering if she should simply accept whatever verdict came. Resign quietly, spare herself the humiliation of a public reckoning. It would have been easier. Nobody would have blamed her for walking away. But there was a version of herself, 17 years old and raising her right hand for the first time, who would have blamed her. So she stayed. The morning of the audit review, the conference room felt different than it had 3 weeks earlier. Sunlight cut through the blinds in long, dust-lit lines across the table, and somewhere down the hall a printer hummed steadily, indifferent to the weight of what was about to happen inside that room. Elena sat with her hands folded in her lap, knuckles pale, watching the auditor. A senior officer with silver hair and the unhurried calm of a man who had seen careers destroyed and rebuilt more times than he could count. Lay a single sheet of paper on the table between them. Nobody spoke. The 2 officers who had watched her with folded arms weeks earlier now leaned forward slightly, as if the air itself had shifted. The auditor tapped the page once, twice, and then looked up. "The discrepancies," he said, "are not yours." The words landed in the room like a held breath finally released. Digital forensics had traced the falsified entries to a series of unauthorized logins, all originating from the same terminal, all time-stamped during hours Elena had been verifiably elsewhere. On deployment, in briefings, asleep in quarters half a world away from the keyboard that had rewritten her record. The clerk, it turned out, had been altering multiple files for over a year, settling old grudges and clearing his own disciplinary history by burying it beneath manufactured failures assigned to officers who had once outranked or outperformed him. Elena was not his only target. She was simply the first one who had refused to stay quiet. There is a version of this story where that would have been enough: vindication, an apology, a quiet return to normal. But something harder sat underneath the relief. Because for 3 weeks, people she respected had looked at her differently. They had let a folder of lies do the work of judging her character, faster and more thoroughly than a decade of honest service ever had. And Elena understood, sitting there in that sunlit room, that this was the real fracture point of the story. Not the forgery itself, but how easily good people had been willing to believe it, simply because it arrived stamped and official. That's the moral weight worth sitting with. It is not enough to trust the truth when it's convenient. Real integrity means questioning even the paperwork that confirms what you already fear. The auditor slid a second document across the table, this one stamped in green. Record cleared. He held it out to her, not with ceremony, but with the plain, quiet respect of one professional to another. Your file will be fully restored, he said. Every commendation, every evaluation, as it should have read from the beginning. Elena took the paper with a hand that was, for the first time in 3 weeks, steady. Behind her, one of the senior officers who had sat in silent judgment rose from his chair. He didn't offer a long speech. He simply crossed the room, extended his hand, and said, "I should have asked more questions before I let a stack of paper change how I saw you." It wasn't a grand gesture. It didn't need to be. Sometimes the most honest apology is the shortest one. Word moved through the unit that afternoon the way it always does, quietly at first, then all at once. By the time Elena walked across the courtyard toward the barracks, she noticed something she hadn't expected. People nodding at her again, not with pity, not with suspicion, but with the plain, unremarkable respect she had earned years before anyone tried to take it from her. Nobody applauded. Nobody made a scene. But the stillness that had followed her for weeks had finally broken, replaced by something steadier. The quiet hum of a record set right. That evening, she sat again at her kitchen table, the same commendation letter beside her. And this time she didn't need to unfold it to remind herself of who she was. She already knew. Because kindness doesn't vanish. It waits, and it finds its way back. And sometimes so does the truth, even after it's been buried under someone else's lies, even after the people who should have trusted you first doubted you last. Elena Carter's record was never broken. It was only hidden for a while, waiting for someone patient enough and brave enough to ask the one question everyone else was too afraid to ask. What if the paperwork is wrong? If the story moved you, stay a little longer. Tell us in the comments what part hit you hardest. And if you believe the truth always finds its way back, hit subscribe, because we tell these stories every week, for everyone who's ever had to fight to be believed.